Hi, Tyrone.
Hi, Jas.
I'm really happy to be here chatting with you today about aesthetic gatekeeping and something I know that I think a lot about or try to think a lot about my work. So I'm happy to nerd out today with you around these topics.
Absolutely. Same here. This is the first time I think we've had a public conversation, so I'm really excited to get in. And knowing, I think I just want to forward the conversation too by saying that although the way that the conversation has been framed has been around a kind of criticism, and of course thinking about C Magazine and writing as a form of criticism, I will be approaching it and thinking about it through the lens of my curation, since that is my my mode of creating and operating. But I think that we can think about criticism in an expanded field. So just wanted to put that out there.
Absolutely. I'm excited to hear more about your curatorial practice in that sense. I know that we wanted to start with a conversation just about what we think constitutes aesthetic gatekeeping and how we define this for the parameters of this conversation and also within our own work independently. Did you want to start or did you want me to start? Or
Would you mind starting?
Sure,
Yeah,
yeah.
that'd be great.
I mean, I have a very specific idea in mind when I think about this concept of aesthetic gatekeeping. And of course, it is one that is tied innately to the collection of Indigenous art and the objects that were created by my ancestors that exist in collections now. I think a lot about collectors and what they did collect at the onset of contact and colonialism in the Americas. And there were always objects that they constituted to be most beautiful and most aesthetically elite. And these are the things or the objects that made their way into collections or into the personal collections of colonizers and explorers and things that would become collections within the museums in Canada. And so for me, there's an innate sort of attachment there between the outsider, what Sarah Ahmed calls the outsider of Indigenous communities, and really looking upon Indigenous communities and really placing value on what they think to be valuable. And then what comes to constitute our histories. So often I'll think about, what was lost? What knowledge of my communities do I not have because it was erased through this sort of gatekeeping process of salvage anthropology? And I think that this continues to happen today in more subtle ways. I think it's harder to wrap your mind around because it's not so obvious. I think we can look at the past and we can find faults in the past, but when it's happening in our contemporary moment, it's harder to place. And so the way that I often think about it is this idea of contemporary Indigenous art and its canon and who is represented there. And from the 1990s onward, we predominantly see this figure of the sovereign. So someone who operates through these high level sort of political orders and concepts. And it tends to be the practices of predominantly men, Indigenous men. And so I think this continues to happen today. There's something happening within this contemporary canonization, this structure of relationships and peoples within art that are really privileging the visions and aesthetics of some folks. And who is left out of that? I believe it's Indigenous women, queer folks, and trans folks who, quote, make ugly art, end quote. And why this is so troubling to me is because in these practices, these little intimate practices happening in the bedrooms and around kitchen tables of girls, Indigenous girls, women, queer and trans folks, there's such a deep ethics that's so related and so integral to Indigenous communities. And then these larger works that circulate. So just for example, like a work like Kent Monkman's, for instance, this is something that really reifies the structure of fine art and the image of fine art, and in this way that pushes out these sort of quiet practices. And that's the way I think about it.
I love that. I mean, I love you sort of like looking or considering women art or art by women and by queer, by the LGBT community as ugly art. So automatically, I think by using that term ugly, you're stepping into this idea of a kind of reification or a kind of enlightenment idea of what is beautiful and what is ugly. And of course, these are the standards by which we operate in a Western canonical sense, right? So like the history of Western art is the history of beautiful art, from one stage to another. and this idea that what we want to bring into our institutions or we want to collect is considered of value. And I guess that is the criticism that we're thinking about. It reminds me of about like, the kind of slip of the tongue by certain museum directors when asked about, the lack of diversity in their collections. They're wont to say, oh, well, we only collect excellence, and or we're looking for a kind of excellence in art making. And I remember, Mark Mayer at the NGC, saying something in 2010, something along the lines of, we're colorblind in our collecting. We're only collecting excellent art. If it's not excellent, it's not in the collection, which speaks about those blind spots, I think, that you're talking about. Because certainly this idea of excellence is a great way of narrowing the field. But of course, that excellence is related to a kind of a way of looking at the world, right? A kind of perceptual lens that we're all expected to share and sort of live up to. I remember as a curator in curatorial school, and the very first class that we took in my master's degree was aesthetics. And of course, you're learning about Plato, and you're learning about Aristotle, and you're learning about this kind of philosophy of aesthetics and taste, and how one can judge the world objectively, or try to be disinterested in the object that you're judging, and judge it dispassionately. So it's this sort of like a fake or a fallacy, the idea that one can be, all sort of like rational and objective in their decision making, and not base their decisions on other sort of more icky, human conditions of bias and just what you're used to, right? So I think it's interesting that the art establishment, or the Western art establishment, relies on this this idea of taste as a way of continuing to keep artists of color, or just art of or ugly art, as you've called it, any art that isn't considered or can't be seen within that worldview. But just to answer that question from my side as well, and that was just sort of me getting excited about what you're thinking about and what you're writing about. But certainly, as a curator, the gatekeeping happens within what we choose to show, right, or what we choose to write about, and any claim of producing. I also see that in certain exhibitions at the level of, say, a biennial, that claim of producing a kind of comprehensive survey or creating an archive or an encyclopedic sort of view of art making at this particular period of time, a kind of authoritative history of a singular or group of artists, period, or genre. But biennials have traditionally been one of the preeminent examples of this kind of gatekeeping, right? Giving the amount of funding, critical attention, and public scrutiny that they draw. They're viewed by most and treated by many as gatekeepers. But I think this opinion has diminished greatly within many art world circles, certainly in the last 20 some odd years, given just the sheer number of biennials currently in existence, right? If they're all representing the best of the best, then what is that? If there's like over 150 biennials around the world, well, what does that even mean anymore? There's a kind of watering down, I think, and yet there is this persistent image or aura, I think, about the biennial, that the art that art being exhibited is critically legitimized in a way that other exhibitions may not impart. But yeah, so that's kind of what I think about, and obviously I want to problematize that through this conversation. But I think that's just sort of how I see aesthetic gatekeeping operating within the curatorial.
I love that you brought Enlightenment Logics into it, because I have spent my whole PhD dissertation just reading about decolonial thought and how Enlightenment Logics really are the core basis of the entire art industry. So for folks who don't know, this idea of Enlightenment Logics, or coloniality, or what comes to be decolonization, comes from this idea that there's a structure of modes of being and thought that came about at the dawn of Enlightenment Logics that also expanded alongside projects of global colonialism and religion, and that these deeply inform our institutions and who we are culturally and socially and just relationally to each other as people. And I see that so much in criticism. I remember I had such a hard time even believing that I was a critic because I didn't write in the same way that critics before me had. And there was something about tone there. There was something about the critic being the expert and using a form of language that was so exclusionary to the peoples who I represent or who brought me into creation and knowledge production through art. And that's just not who I really want to be writing work for. And so I think a lot about how can I create these forms of writing that are more collaborative with artists. And that's in journalism. I remember that just being so like, you don't do that. Like, you have to be so removed from the artist, and artists are touchy and artists are hard to work with. And it just felt so counterintuitive to me, like these two functions of art are working against each other, when in fact it would be just so beautiful if we could bring together this sort of collaborative space of knowledge generation wherein critics or writers do work alongside artists and create these beautiful temporalities that we're talking about, or new modes of thought that are futuristic ways of relating under art that don't rely on Enlightenment logics. And I'm sure that people look to my work and they think I just want to burn it all down, but I don't. I really think that I think we can do this differently. I do. I think that, I mean, it happened with Indigenous art in the 1990s and feminist art in the 1970s. It's like some critics and some artists just trying to define a new mode of being or an alternative form of aesthetics outside of formalism. I think this comes back in waves, and it's not just now.
Yeah, well, I do agree with you. Like, I think that I think, you know, it's not just you and your writing. I think there's a lot of sentiment right now, you know, amongst critics, amongst artists specifically or especially, this idea that yeah, we need to kind of burn it all down, right? That we need to think that the idea that systemic racism, the systemic issues that can be traced all the way back to, as you said, the beginning of the Enlightenment. You know, how do you operate within that, right? It's an all-encompassing system, you know, no matter whether it's the language of English that we use, that we generally use, or it's the institution of the museum, or it's the idea of collecting, or it's just the fact that we all live in sort of colonial, we all live in a colonial existence, right? Like we live in the kind of the ripple effect of colonialism. So there's very little space that we can see outside of that. So then how then do you operate within it? Like, how do you create spaces of like you're saying, like, how do you write in a way that is not, you know, in reintroducing those aesthetic judgments, or reifying, you know, the artwork that you're writing about, but in fact writing alongside of it, right? I think about like Trinh Minh Ha's like notion of like, you know, of thinking or writing or creating nearby something, rather than actually writing about it or trying to describe it or define it, right? And I think about that in curating as well. I mean, you know, and it's interesting that you said about sort of like seeing things more collaboratively, because I do feel, for instance, the biennial, that the Toronto Biennial, which, you know, we just did 2019 and we're working on 2022, I'm very conscious of the fact that the Indigenous artists that are presented within the biennial, like you know, without Candace Hopkins, who is my, you know, one of my co-curators of this, I would find it harder to really honor the, you know, the histories and the kind of the meaning within the works and the worlds that those works represent without the dialogue with Candace, right? And similarly, you know, I'm working with artists from different diasporic communities typically, and I approach that work as a diasporic individual myself. However, you know, I don't share the subject positions of all the people I'm with. And so how then do I curate and sort of create work with them, right? So that the work itself is a kind of a representation of the conversation, the dialogue that we have had. And which is one of the reasons why so much of the work that we do, that we've done or that I've done is commission based, right? Is creating a kind of dialogue with the artist in order to create something that is in some ways, it's definitely their idea and their work. You know, I don't author it, but I can write about how, or I can think about, or I can like grapple with that which we share, right? Through the making of that work. So process is also really important, I think, in thinking about ways of working in ways of working that don't rely upon a kind of judgment or value judgment of this work, saying, oh, well, this work, you know, is important because it, you know, I mean, the typical way that curators do this is that they compare it to other work in the canon, right? Or they'll suggest, they'll define a kind of you know, I love the terminology of the turn, or of like you know, or of a kind of advancing culture. And so you're going to say, well, this art is important because it, oh, hey, look, it actually represents this moment in time, and it ties to, you know, this this history or lineage of formal abstraction, or of something other than that, something along those lines. And that is how we then say, well, that's why it's important. So you're going to add that to your museum collection, because if you do a, you know, an abstraction show, you can show abstraction from, like, you know, the 50s until the present day. And so I think that these ideas of a kind of a history and history making, or canonization, is part of that, and we need to get away from that, I think, more and more.
Mm-hmm. I agree. I think in a lot of my work, I've tried to be anti-canonic, and in some ways I've failed, in some ways I've succeeded. And when I think about this conversation, I often think about a conversation I had with Shelley Nero when I was interviewing her she had a Lifetime Achievement Award, the Scotiabank Photography Award in Toronto. And I asked her about her early work, because it was always so interesting to me that much of this work, it just existed on like camcorder film, and really not like high art like materials that you would think of to be inside a collection or a gallery, or formal enough that they could be seen as excellent or valuable work. And when I asked her about her usage of these lesser, so-called lesser materials, she simply said, that was all I had access to. I was a young 20-year-old Native woman. I was a single working mother. I didn't have money to spend on art materials. I didn't know how to write an art grant. I didn't go to art school. This is just what I could get on my hands on to create with. And so that makes me think a lot about the work that I'm overlooking right now, because, or I guess at a certain point, it did make me think a lot about the work that I'm overlooking by being so ingrained in the system of biennial culture and the new opening at whatever exhibition, and the same people who sort of curate or decide what this image of Indigenous art is going to be within Canada. And for me, that has meant looking to alternative forms of aesthetics. Yeah, so trying to think of different ways to curate outside of the gallery system. And this has included things like memes and TikTok accounts, and expanding visual culture to this place where it can be more accessible to the folks who have something to say but don't have the access or the space to say those things. And there's like this idea of, I don't know how to quite state this, but formalism and grandeur often that gets caught up in this idea of fine art and biennial culture, just like the wow factor of the art that we go and see. And sometimes it's kind of nice to look at understated work, to look at the messaging behind the work that we're looking at. And I know some would say that this is identity politics, and then we're looking to the identity of the creator rather than the actual process or the formal materials or the value of the work itself. But I don't agree. I think that we have to rebalance our expectations of what we are viewing based on these considerations, such as who has access to these materials to make so-called beautiful and excellent art. Absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's interesting that you know, this idea of the kind of you know, the poor materials, and the way in which, you know, many artists, I think, you know, start off in that way. You know, whether it's, you know, just stuff they do at home that they you know, or sketches, or just things that they never actually think about in terms of its longevity and preserving it. But then curators well, I don't work in an institution, but curators come along and go, oh, like they discover these things and then show them in an exhibition, right, in an institution, and then suddenly this scrap piece of paper becomes a valuable art object, or attains a certain level of value within the structure of the institution, right? So I think it's interesting, this kind of like dilemma that we have, where the work that we do as critics or as curators, although we're turning our gaze towards the kind of the overlooked, right? By doing that, we in turn inscribe value on that overlooked object, that then turns it into a valuable object. Right? So it's almost like this bind of like, well, anywhere we decide to look, because the roles that we are in are seen as these kind of gatekeeping roles. It's really a hard nut to crack, or it's a hard bind to unravel, right? Like I think about, like, is it best just to kind of like not sort of represent that work, or or is there a problem even with doing that? I mean, maybe there's no problem with it. Maybe it's great that Shelley Nero's early work gets rediscovered, gets into an institution, and her fuller history is then preserved and can be told, right? So I'm not saying that it's also wrong that we do that. I just think that there is that kind of like complexity, I think, to what you're talking about.
Yeah, I think about this too. I think that the idea that by us finding value in this work, it gives it value, has been untrue in my case. I think I've been like writing about a lot of artists, like queer and trans artists, and I haven't had them see the same significant sort of success as many of their Native men peers, for instance. And also I'm writing about community artists who have never shown in a gallery sometimes. And this does very, I've noticed it does very little to bolster their positioning with an art if I write a review about their work or I curate them into a show. And seldom, I think maybe for a couple exceptions, such as Dana Danger, have the artists that I've wanted to bolster have sort of shot up to like the pinnacle of success of their men peers. So I think there is definitely a truism to that, but at the same time, I disagree. I think that the structures of the system are still there, and they're still, and what's interesting to me is that when art came to a halt during COVID-19, these so-called community artists, or these like vendors, they were still in business. They were still shipping work. They were still making sales online, and the market came to a complete halt. So I do think it's kind of like a structural thing that we need to shift our vantage point, and we need to shift the way that we think about art and what constitutes art, what constitutes success, because art could die tomorrow. I mean, we're living in pretty scarce times, but Indigenous art will always exist forever.
Yeah, no, and yeah, I do see what you're saying, and I do agree. I think that in thinking about the way in which works can be reified and brought, and given value, that again is giving power to those structures that try to set up hierarchies, right? That set up the kind of division between what's valuable and what's not. And that's something that in many cases, and I think this is why we say things like blow it all up. It's well, there's no as we've seen with any kind of like anti-capitalist political or ephemeral work. The capitalism finds a way, right? Or the system finds a way of absorbing it. But I think what is interesting now, and you brought up COVID and kind of what we see happening, is also important in the sense of like that I see more and more, I feel like I am meeting more and more artists who are just not interested in that system, right? That are very happy to work within community, to create their own networks, right? And to find value within that themselves, right? So it's this kind of I think you were using like this idea of like a non-aesthetic or a counter-aesthetic, you were terming it, but it just made me think of this idea of purposely making quote unquote ugly art, or purposely making art that doesn't have value in that other realm or that other world. And I think about this too, because, you know, and I think, you know, Maya and I might have talked about this before, but there are, I know a number of artists who are making work to survive, right? Like, or who are like you're saying, like selling, not through galleries, but making t-shirts or making, you know, little tchotchkes, or just making things in order to make a living in a world that is very, you know, it's very expensive, right? I live in Toronto. It's a very expensive place to live. So how are you going to survive if you don't have a gallery that's selling your artwork, right? And, you know, it's not like the 60s and 70s where artists could just live in, you know, squat in places and just survive. You can't do that. So artists, I think, especially, you know, artists on the margins, are finding other ways of making work. And I think that I think they're creating entirely new value ecosystems that are separate from the art world. And I think that's really important.
It's true. There's like this whole sort of digital infrastructure of art that's like evolving, that exists outside of the galleries, and it has a life of its own. Yeah. And I think that something that you brought up really made me think about this idea of artists on the margins are there because of the systemic barriers that put them there and privilege some people or position peoples above them. But it's true that I was literally thinking about this idea of this conversation we're having in art about folks making Indigenous art who perhaps do not have claim to Indigenous identity, and the ways that aesthetics are taken up by folks like us, like critics, and who say, oh, here's this new emergent mode of thought or mode of Indigenous art. And then you're so right. It's just kind of dawned on me, it becomes a sort of like viral aesthetic that people can appropriate, but it doesn't necessarily privilege the people always who created this aesthetic. Sometimes it just becomes this appropriated aesthetic that then works its way into the institution. The layers of that are kind of blowing my mind now that you brought it up.
Can you articulate that more? I want to get what you're saying.
Okay, it's like, what am I trying to say here? Like, so for instance, let's talk about like Amy Malbouf and how she brought this sort of aesthetic of reconnecting to Indigenous culture through things like tufting or Indigenous art practice, things like beading, or things that you do in ceremony alongside aunties. And then in the preceding decade of that show, Kai Sigo, that she did at AGO and traveled, where she showed those tufting works, there was this sort of explosion of material works in Indigenous art amongst young women.
They're often creating alongside. Anyways, so those are just two ways that I thought was interesting, and I'm curious to hear what you have to say about this text.
Yeah, so I have a lot of feelings about this text. I've worked in and out the side of this text a lot. Okay, where to start? Oh my gosh. Yes, I have learned so much from David Garneau in my critical work. I think, honestly, if I hadn't read David Garneau early in my career, I don't even know if I would have known that the type of criticism that he does, and I hopefully am a part of a lineage of, was even possible. So I'm so indebted to David Garneau's work internally. That said, there is something about this piece that is a little immaterial for me. And particularly because it responds specifically to a piece about the lack of decolonial consideration in Kent Monkman's paintings. And why this is troubling to me is because this is a conversation that has been happening in closed Indigenous communities for decades about the value of Kent Monkman's work to Indigenous peoples. Certainly, Kent Monkman's work is immensely important to Canadian publics regarding their education about reconciliation. I teach Kent Monkman's work every semester in my class, but isn't made by and for Indigenous peoples? No, I think art has this way of thinking really immaterially about the things that we talk about in ideas in very abstractive ways. But the truth is, we can't think ourselves out of the material conditions of the work that we make and the work that we write about. And the truth about Kent Monkman's work is that it is created in a studio by white hands. He has very little to do with it outside of the conceptualization of the aesthetics that exist within the work. And Garneau specifically, he stakes his whole critique on being a Métis critic, which I think is very interesting, because throughout his career, he spent a lot of time really distancing himself from Métis aunties or any form of, I guess, accountability from Métis aunties or the discourse of Métis aunties. And when he helped to design the coin with Louis Riel's image on it, which famously Louis Riel was hung by the Canadian government, so just a very insensitive act, a lot of Métis people is considered. He even went so far as saying that we need to recognize as Métis peoples that we also come from European ancestors, and that is not what it means to be a Métis person to me. So my question to Garneau is, if you're sticking your claim on being a Métis critic, is that not identity politics, which you sort of say you're in opposition to within this whole theory and this work that you're doing? And then also, what precisely makes you Métis if you're only accountable to a generation or to our white ancestors and not our Indigenous ancestors? That's very interesting to me. And yes, again, if we're talking about the work of feminists that have actual Indigenous hands and peoples making this work and ethical processes that are based in community and a lot of care and consideration in the material practices that happens in the creation of queer, trans, and feminist work, how can that even be compared to painting like Kent Monkman's that is predominantly produced for a white audience and patronage and aesthetic? So I don't have high opinions of that paper. I think it was a bit reactionary and I think it wasn't well supported. That's my thoughts.
Noted. Very well noted. No, again, I don't know that I haven't read the paper inside and out, so I haven't given it as much thought as you have clearly. And I think that, I think we're in a situation where you have this wealth of knowledge and information at your disposal in order to critique a piece of writing like this, right? So as you said, Kent Monkman's work has been discussed within community for a very long time, which is a very different discussion than what is happening within the white art establishment, right? It's read very differently. I do have to say that, that because he starts off with a kind of, I think, a joke, between a Métis curator and I don't know who the artist was, but an Indigenous artist, sort of saying, this looks like a Norman Rockwell painting, which is like a coded critique of the work, but might be read by non-Indigenous audiences as a kind of, oh, well, this must be part of the canon because it looks like Norman Rockwell. But in fact, it's also this critique of the fact that Norman Rockwell ignored, all of the atrocities of the 1950s. And this is, again, a kind of spectacle of the atrocities of a particular moment in time. Mm-hmm. That being said, I'm not here to defend Garneau's piece. I do think that it speaks to, this conversation speaks to the need for dialogue, right? The need for this kind of intercultural, across difference dialogue where the kind of codedness of certain things are unpacked for how we unpack them for each other, right? Because there is not going to be a way forward if there isn't that level of openness, right, between interested parties. Obviously, not everybody is interested in kind of cross-cultural dialogue, but or approaching it in a good way. But I think that the benefit to that, or the need for it, is immense, because we're at a moment in time, I think, that is increasingly divided, where social media, the bubbles that we create, the echo chambers that we create, and you talked about sort of like online and the memes and sort of all of that is constructed within very capitalist formations. I mean, the internet is a capitalist formation, right? So it is there to divide people, right? It's there to kind of like for us all to really believe in our individual rights and freedoms, expressed through our individual right and freedom to just yell at the world, right? Or to create a world that, or to only create and see and support the world that we want to create and see, versus actually seeing the world as it is and dialoguing with the people that are in it. So I think that there is a, anyways, I just wanted to highlight that I think that there is this definite need, especially in Canada, in terms of the Indigenous art world, or the world in which Indigenous art circulates in these very different ecosystems, right? And sometimes those conversations, erupt into conflict, and sometimes I think there's a kind of silence, right? There's a kind of, you go your way, we're going to go our way, and no one's going to talk about the elephant in the room type of thing. I don't know. That's just sort of my thinking.
Yeah, I think there is definitely a lot of conflict in art, and there's also systemic barriers like masculinity and misogyny and racism and all these things that really materially exist for people who are trying to work in the arts, because art is a workplace. It's not an immaterial sort of imaginary place. It's a place where we go and we put in time and we get money for our labor. And I agree, didactics is so important here. I will say that I don't think it's a responsibility, though, of feminists and queer folks and trans folks to really spoon feed it to folks who become reactionary, like David Garneau and his critique of these sort of perspectives. I think, like, I really agree that dialogue is the way forward and that we have to move alongside each other to really remedy these things in our communities. But at the same time, the only thing that I see reified in this specific sect of criticism that Garneau preaches is this position of the expert, and this position of the all-knowing, sort of all-seeing, like, expert, capital M man. And I think it's really, conversations are shifting, and those people, they can come with us, but sometimes they choose not to. Something is happening with Kent Monkman's work right now. He published on Instagram that image of the Indigenous women's community raping Justin Trudeau with a rather giant butt plug, and there was a huge backlash from Indigenous community, and he shifted his aesthetics, and they almost look exactly the same as Lauren Crazybull's. And Lauren Crazybull has been doing this sort of anti-formalist work where we're talking about portraiture of queer and trans folks. So the shift is happening. These folks can follow us into this like future and this discussion that's happening, but I really think it does mean taking personal accountability as a community of peoples with each other for the sort of systemic things that we bring to these conversations as well.
Absolutely, and I do say that his use, like even the Latin word, the ekaphrasis, and his, he refers to Dionysian and Apollonian ideals. Like there is a kind of you see within the text a need to justify within a kind of a colonial Enlightenment art knowledge system, right? So certainly that is definitely embedded within the text, and embedded within a lot of texts and within a lot of exhibitions that are out there. Again, sort of, because it's everywhere, it becomes invisible like air, right? But it's present. And I do agree with you. I think one of the things that I'm taking from this conversation that I think is really important is this idea of the kind of, it's not about storming the gates, it's about walking right by, right? It's about like not wanting to enter in. And also this idea, and this comes from work that I've done with certain several people have done this to me. And I remember when it first happened, it was sort of like, such, kind of like off-putting, but then I kind of appreciated and understood it, which was, this idea that there are worlds that I do not know of, that I do not know about. And this group that I'm talking about, and I'm not going to name names, but they wanted to create all of these events but not promote them more broadly, or not explain them, and like you said, spoon feed them to other audiences, right? It was really for a very specific audience, and they were very happy getting 3 or 4 people to this thing. If it was just them, they'd be happy as well. And I remember having this conversation where I was just like, well, how does that function? Because as a curator, you're thinking about exhibitions, and you're thinking about publics, and you're thinking about this kind of neoliberal idea of like more the better, you need more audiences, all that kind of thing. But I have since grown into this idea that no, the opacity within that, right? And here I'm using opacity in a way where I'm thinking about this kind of like refusal. It's just a refusal to be seen. It's a refusal to need to be visible and knowable within that world, right? We don't need it. It's like, we're not storming the gates, we're going to walk on by. So I do appreciate that.
I do appreciate your approach of dialectics, though, and thinking about how we can have this unified vision to come together and analyze and be in relation around art. I think I said didactics before, but I just so appreciate your perspective on dialectics. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we're out of time. At least I think we're getting the markers for it.
Yeah, thank you both so much for such a thoughtful discussion. I have a question for you both, but we also have some questions in the Q&A. Maybe if there's time, I'll ask my question. So I have a question from Clara, and she's asking, are there any texts either of you recommend as good introductions to the relationship between Enlightenment aesthetics / ideologies and colonialism?
Yes. So my favorite thinker in this realm is Sylvia Wynter, because she brings in a consideration of misogyny and patriarchy and the different things that created these things in tandem. But definitely check out Wynter's work, particularly Coloniality of Man.
I will go with that. I don't, off the top of my head, I'm not a good recaller of names and things like that. So.
Oh, and Maria Lugones. I also like her. She wrote Feminist Decolonial Theory. Very good.
Yeah, thank you both for that. That's really great. I love Sylvia Wynter. And the next question is for Tairone. Someone's asking, you mentioned the power of leaning into the fiction when writing art criticism. Could you articulate that further and perhaps suggest some texts or writers who do this?
Again, you know what, if you send me these questions, I'm happy to go into my notes and find the titles and the proper names of texts to suggest. So I can do that. So I'm not going to do that here. But what I did mean by that, and I was sort of referencing something that Garneau was describing in terms of a way of working alongside art that one might not be fully familiar with or able to understand, is to first kind of describe the work, or to kind of like really look deeply. And I do believe in kind of close observation and looking and what that can bring up for us as as critics, as curators. But also being cognizant of the fact that the eyes are not the only thing that one wants to use when observing or thinking about how a work makes one feel. All the senses, I think, are also really critical in terms of that interpretation. But in any case, and then the second to that. And those are my elaborations on Garneau's thing. That's not him saying that. And then the other thing that Garneau was saying was to, as far as I interpret it, was this idea of a kind of creative writing, or a kind of leaning into a kind of almost like a poetic writing, where you're creating associations as I see them, rather than descriptions, right? So you're not drawing connections between the work and other things, but you're actually calling up associations that it might have for you. And I think, in terms of curation, I think that this can occur, but then I do want to say that I think that there is there are issues with that as well, right? This idea of the intuition, or the idea of a kind of the creative curator, I think, can be a very dangerous role that one can step into, because you then become the artist and you don't curate. But I think it's more possible within writing.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. We have another question here. They say, thank you for the talk. I'm just wondering what you mean when you refer to the stigmatization of ugly art. When you refer to marginal artworks as ugly, is this in reference to the low market value of their primary tools, i.e. not working with oil on canvas? Since Dada and Fluxus, the avant-garde has established a tendency to experiment with ugliness to the point where beauty or high value materials don't always seem to be central to be a central quality required of excellent contemporary art. Do you see these tendencies as impactful or still marginal in the art world in terms of material conditions? Could more artists run and publicly funded spaces help foster more grassroots more grassroots environments for emerging practices? Could this be a way to refuse the high value oil painting market?
There's a lot there.
Yeah, a long question.
Just for reference, where I pulled this idea of ugly art from, it was written about by Bell Hooks in her collection Yearning, or Race, Gender, and Politics. And it's this really beautiful collection about aesthetics and postmodernism, and just it was just like the best collection I've maybe read on the topic. Sherry Farrell-Rosette actually recommended that I read this book, and it deeply influenced me. And the way that she talks about ugly art is the art that's happening in living rooms between Black women created together, things that aren't considered art. So when she says ugly, she doesn't mean like in this empirical sense that it physically is ugly. She means that it's something that is considered ugly by white people, or it's something that's considered ugly within the gallery or within the formalist aesthetics of the gallery. It's something that would never be in a collection, as Tairone puts it, where only the most excellent objects are, and that's what makes it ugly.
And I just wanted to jump in to go back to the question that I answered, and about a book to sort of look at. I just realized that I have it on my desk, but Saidiya Hartman's writing, any of her writing, but Wayward Lives, Beautiful Experiments is what I'm on to right now. But it's an example of a kind of, she is an academic, she is a writer, she's a creative voice, and the way in which she writes about the kind of the spaces within the archive in which you don't find these stories of Black women, or of what she calls wayward, the wayward, queer and trans as well, how she narrates those stories, and in that narration really takes a lot of creative license to kind of to sort of narrate those lives. And it's largely because there is no information, or very little information about these people and these bodies. And so it's a really beautiful, I think, way of dealing with the Cesseras within the archive.
Mm-hmm. Thank you both for that. We have, I think we have time for one more question. So someone's asking, if the kind of decolonial you're proposing is associated with a position that places itself to the side or as the side, how do you see the system of art production change in order to attend to the side? And would it even be desirable to assimilate the sides into the institution?
People have written books about this. You want to take this one, Tairone?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I'll answer it. Well, I'll try to answer the last part head on. The first part, I don't know, I'll answer it alongside of it. But would I want to see these types of experiments, or incorporated into the institution? No, I think that we've seen how that does not work. And certainly, if we think about the institutionalization of alternative spaces, of alternative magazines, of alternative, and anything alternative, or marginal at one point, if it's around long enough, becomes an institution in its own right. And And in fact, the professionalization of these spaces and of these organizations is really problematic, because it adopts these Western modes of organizing people, right? So there's hierarchies, and there's the lived life of individuals is not honored within these spaces, right? We become all worker bees that just produce. So I don't think that it's good to kind of be incorporated. I do have to say that a lot of these spaces then are very temporary, and I think temporariness is a really important aspect of these exceptional spaces. I think that we should respect and honor the fact that oftentimes the best things happen amongst groups of people who are there in a very particular moment of time, at a very particular place, and they're very particular people at very particular moments in their lives. Like, there's all of that at play in creating these beautiful moments, and it doesn't always last. Well, I would say it never lasts, right? It just doesn't. So that's what I would say to that.
Yeah. I agree. There's some really exciting work happening right now about this idea of personal archives, or archives that self-destruct, and how they can be this sort of anti-imperialist mode of really destabilizing one single archive. And I too am sort of aligned with this queer ideology that I came up with in this post-structuralist ideology, where I believe that, the work I do attempts to defy identification or defy these structures. That said, I feel like if my peoples were fully integrated into these systems, queer, trans, Indigenous people, I probably would still be in the margins trying to find out what's next, because I think that should be our goal as curators and critics, really pushing us that forward and intervening on institutions. Absolutely.
Yeah, that was actually kind of similar to the question I wanted to ask. So that's really great that we got to talk about that. Thank you both again so much for being part of the symposium, for sharing your thoughts tonight. This is the third event in our symposium, and our next event is Who Speaks for Whom and Who. It's a talk featuring Lufemi Taiwo and David Garneau. So maybe there's some of this conversation that will come into play next week. To register for this event or future ones, please visit the link in the chat, and all of our symposium events are free. We are also offering a 33% discount on subscriptions for attendees of today's programs. So if the work we do means something to you, please visit special.cmagazine.com to claim this special offer. And if there isn't anything else, thank you again. It's been wonderful to have a chat with both of you tonight. And thanks everyone. Have a good night.